Princess Charlotte had an important royal duty of her own.
Who's the boss? Princess Charlotte. It can be tough being the daughter of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, not least of which because your life is very public.
Did you know that 7-year-old Princess Charlotte has been described as having the same shy yet fun personality as her grandmother?
There are moments in life that remind us that no title, no privilege, and no amount of wealth can shield a person from cruelty. And there are other moments, quieter, more powerful ones, that remind us what real dignity looks like. This is one of those stories. It is a story about a young girl who happened to be a princess, a boy who didn't know how to belong, and a father who chose understanding over anger. What unfolded between them would quietly change an entire school, and leave everyone who heard about it completely speechless. Lambrook School sits nestled in the Berkshire countryside, a place of rolling green fields, ivy-draped buildings, and the kind of quiet order that speaks to generations of tradition. It is the kind of school where blazers are pressed, manners are valued, and excellence is expected, not just in academics, but in character. For most students, it is a place of warmth and belonging, a second home where friendships are forged and memories are made. Princess Charlotte, daughter of Prince William and the Princess of Wales, had settled into Lambrook with remarkable ease. Despite the extraordinary circumstances of her birth, Charlotte carried herself with a simplicity that made her easy to like. She laughed freely, worked diligently, helped younger students without being asked, and never once used her royal name as a reason to expect more than anyone else. Teachers quietly admired her composure. Friends were drawn to her warmth. She was, by every measure, just a girl trying to do her best. That is why what happened during the autumn term was so unexpected, and so deeply unsettling. His name was Marcus. He arrived midterm, transferred from a private school in another county, carrying with him a reputation for being difficult. He was tall for his age, sharp-tongued, and possessed of the kind of confidence that masked something far more fragile underneath. Within his first week, Marcus had already made his presence felt, talking over teachers, making cutting remarks during group discussions, and laughing too loudly at moments that weren't particularly funny. Most students gave him space. A few tried to befriend him. Charlotte, as was her nature, treated him politely and without judgment. That, unfortunately, did not seem to help. It started small, as these things often do. During a history class, when the teacher asked students to discuss the role of the monarchy in modern society, Marcus leaned back in his chair and said loudly, "Well, maybe we should ask someone with personal experience." A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Charlotte looked up briefly, then returned to her notes. She said nothing. The teacher redirected the class. The moment passed. But Marcus had noticed something important in that moment. He had noticed that Charlotte would not fight back. Over the days that followed, the comments continued, never loud enough to be an obvious declaration, never direct enough to be immediately reported, but always pointed. When Charlotte answered a question correctly in maths, Marcus muttered to the boy beside him, "Probably has private tutors for every subject." When she was selected to represent the class in a school debate, he said, just quietly enough, "Funny how those things work out." When she brought in a beautifully illustrated project on ecosystems, he glanced at it and said to no one in particular, "Must be nice to have resources." Each comment was a small stone. Alone, any one of them might have been dismissed. Together, they were building something heavier than Charlotte could easily carry. What made it particularly difficult was how invisible it all seemed. Marcus was clever about it. He chose moments when teachers were distracted, hallways that were almost empty, lunch tables where the surrounding noise swallowed his words before they could be reported. He was never physically threatening. He never used language that would have triggered immediate intervention. He operated in the gray spaces between what could be proved and what could be felt, and what Charlotte felt was a slow, creeping sense that school was no longer safe. She didn't tell anyone. Not her closest friends. Not the school counselor. Not her parents. She had grown up understanding, in ways few children her age could, that the world watched her family closely, and that anything she said or did could become larger than she intended. She also, perhaps, worried that people would think she was overreacting. That they would say she was too sensitive. that they would remind her that words were just words. But words, as Charlotte was learning, could do something that bruises could not. They could make you question your own worth. There was an afternoon in the art studio that she would remember for a long time. She had been working on a watercolor landscape, carefully laying down layers of blue and gray to recreate the view from a favorite hillside. The room was peaceful, filled with the soft sounds of brushes on paper and the occasional scrape of a stool. Marcus walked past behind her, and without breaking his stride, said quietly near her ear, "Even your painting looks like it was done by someone who's never had to try." Then he moved on, sat down at his own desk, and began to sketch as though nothing had happened. Charlotte's brush paused over the paper. Her throat tightened. She placed the brush down carefully, pressed her hands flat on the table, and breathed. Then she picked the brush back up and kept painting. But her hands were not quite steady, and she knew it. That evening, at home, she sat cross-legged on the floor of her bedroom with her back against the bed. Her school bag was beside her, half unpacked. A book lay open in her lap, but she wasn't reading it. She was staring at a spot on the floor, replaying the afternoon in her mind, not just the art studio, but every comment that had come before it. Every sideways glance. Every muttered remark. Every moment she had chosen silence because she didn't want to cause a fuss. For the first time since Marcus had arrived at Lambrook, she cried. Not dramatically. Just quietly, in the dim light of her room, with no one watching. She wiped her face, sat up straighter, and told herself it would pass. It didn't pass. If anything, it intensified. Marcus seemed to grow bolder as the weeks went on. Perhaps he interpreted Charlotte's silence as weakness. Perhaps he enjoyed the fact that he had found a way to unsettle someone untouchable. Whatever his reasons, his behavior became more deliberate. In PE one morning, when the class was running laps and Charlotte pulled slightly ahead, Marcus jogged beside her just long enough to say, "Don't get too comfortable at the front. Even royals finish last sometimes." Then he slowed down, veered off, and rejoined a group of boys, laughing at something entirely unrelated. In the school library, when Charlotte was searching for a book on classical architecture, she looked up to find Marcus standing at the end of the aisle, watching her. When she made eye contact, he gave a slow, exaggerated bow. She turned back to the shelf, her heart hammering. He left notes. Small, folded pieces of paper that appeared on her desk, unsigned, their origins untraceable. One read, "Some people are born lucky. Don't confuse luck with talent." Another simply said, "We all know why you're really here." She kept them, tucking them into the back of a notebook, not because she wanted to, but because some part of her wasn't sure what to do with them. And then, one day, something shifted. A girl named Priya had been watching. Priya was quiet by nature, more likely to observe than to speak, but she had sharp eyes and a long memory. She had been in the art studio when Marcus made his comment about Charlotte's painting. She had been in the corridor when he mimicked a bow. She had been close enough at lunch, on more than one occasion, to see the way Charlotte's expression changed. Just briefly, just barely, before she composed herself and carried on. Priya went to her form teacher after class one Thursday afternoon. She didn't present it as gossip or drama. She presented it as a concern. She described, carefully and factually, what she had witnessed over several weeks. She named specific instances. She was calm, detailed, and credible. The teacher listened carefully. Then she thanked Priya and told her she had done the right thing. The school's response was swift, but measured. The head teacher, a woman with decades of experience managing complex situations with both precision and compassion, reviewed everything. Priya's account, observations from other members of staff who had noticed something without quite putting the pieces together, and the quiet notes that the school counselor had been keeping since Charlotte's manner had begun to change. The picture that emerged was clear and troubling. Marcus was called in. Charlotte was given the opportunity to speak with the head teacher privately, in a setting where she felt safe. She was honest, in the measured way that had become characteristic of her. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't seek consequences for Marcus. She simply said that school had begun to feel different, that she came in the mornings with a knot in her stomach, and that she wasn't sure what she had done to cause it. "Nothing," the head teacher said gently. "You have done nothing." Charlotte nodded. But hearing it said aloud, by someone in authority, in a warm and quiet room, it helped more than she would have expected. That same evening, Prince William was told. He had noticed the change in his daughter over the preceding weeks. He had mentioned it to his wife. That Charlotte seemed quieter, more withdrawn, that her laugh, which had always been easy and frequent, had become rarer. They had both put it down to the natural fluctuations of school life, the pressure of a new term, the ordinary heaviness that sometimes descends on children without obvious cause. When the school called and explained what they had discovered, he sat for a long moment after the phone call ended, quietly processing everything. He did not call the press. He did not consult a communications team. He did not request a formal inquiry or threaten consequences. He made one decision. He would go to the school the next morning and he would talk to the boy himself. William arrived at Lambrook early, before most students had finished breakfast. He requested a private meeting and was shown into a quiet room. He asked to speak with Marcus, and the school arranged it. When Marcus came in and saw who was waiting for him, his carefully constructed air of indifference faltered. He stood in the doorway for a moment, visibly uncertain. Then sat down across the table. William didn't begin with accusations. He began with a question. "How are you finding it here?" he asked. "Honestly." Marcus blinked. He had clearly expected something very different, a reprimand, perhaps, or a formal complaint. The directness of the question, the genuineness in the tone, caught him entirely off guard. He answered quietly. He said he found Lambrook difficult. That he didn't feel like he fit in. That at his last school he had been part of a particular group, and here, everyone already had their friends, their routines, their places. He said he felt like an outsider looking in through glass. William nodded slowly. "I know that feeling," he said. Marcus looked up. William talked about his own childhood, not in a way that sought sympathy, but in a way that was honest. He talked about the pressure of expectation, the difficulty of finding genuine connection when your circumstances set you apart, the loneliness that can exist even in the middle of a crowded room. He talked about times he had handled things badly, said things he regretted, pushed people away when he should have let them in. Then he said something that Marcus would carry with him for a long time afterward. "The way you treated my daughter," William said quietly, "wasn't really about her. Was it?" It wasn't a question. And Marcus, for the first time in weeks, had nothing clever to say. He looked at the table. His jaw tightened. And then, slowly, his shoulders dropped. "No," he said. "It wasn't." What followed was a conversation, not a confrontation. William was clear, unambiguously, firmly clear, that what Marcus had done was harmful and unacceptable, that it had caused real damage to a real person who had treated him with nothing but courtesy. But he was also clear that he was not there to destroy Marcus. He was there because he believed that people, especially young people, were capable of better than their worst moments, and because he wanted Marcus to believe that too. Marcus apologized. First in that room, to William. Then, later that afternoon, in a brief and private moment arranged by the school, to Charlotte herself. He stood in front of her in the corridor outside the library, hands slightly awkward at his sides, and said that he was sorry. That he had been unkind. That she hadn't deserved any of it. He didn't dress it up or make excuses. He just said it plainly. Charlotte looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for saying so." And that was that. It would be tidy to say that everything changed overnight. It didn't. The weeks that followed were careful and sometimes uncomfortable. Marcus kept a low profile, aware that he was being watched, working through his own private reckoning with what he had done and who he wanted to be. Some students who had stayed close to Charlotte out of loyalty began to relax. Others, who had distanced themselves for fear of being caught in the middle, gradually came back. Charlotte, for her part, took her time. She returned to raising her hand in class. She returned to the easy laugh that her friends had missed. She started volunteering again at the school reading program, sitting with younger children and helping them through stories one word at a time. She was not untouched by what had happened. She was quieter about certain things than she had been before, more deliberate in how she moved through the world. But there was something new in her, too. A kind of steadiness that hadn't been there before. As though she had walked through something difficult and discovered that she was still standing. Priya, who had started everything by speaking up, became one of her closer friends. They ate lunch together most days, talking about books and art and things that had nothing to do with anything that had happened. The ordinariness of it was itself a relief. The school, taking note of everything that had occurred during that term, made changes. The head teacher introduced regular sessions on respect and inclusion, woven into the existing curriculum in a way that felt natural rather than imposed. Students were invited to talk, in small groups, about what it meant to belong, what made a community feel safe, what made it feel otherwise, and what any individual could do to shift that balance. The sessions were student-led, which made them feel genuine rather than instructional. Marcus participated. At first reluctantly, then with increasing honesty. He was good at it, as it turned out. He had a way of saying difficult things plainly, without softening them so much that they lost their meaning. Slowly, through those conversations, he found something he hadn't expected to find at Lambrook, a place where being honest was worth more than being clever. He joined the school's robotics program, introduced to it by a boy named Elliot who had overheard him talking about engineering in a way that made it clear he knew more than he let on in class. Within a month, he and Elliot were the team most likely to represent the school at the regional competition. He was still abrasive sometimes, still said things that landed wrong. But the culture around him had changed, and so, slowly, had he. Charlotte knew none of the finer details of Marcus's journey. She didn't need to. She had her own journey to attend to. Near the end of the spring term, the school held a student assembly themed around the idea that every voice matters. Charlotte was one of several students invited to speak briefly, about anything, in any way they chose. She stood at the front of the hall, in front of her year group, and spoke for about 3 minutes. She didn't tell her own story directly. She spoke instead about the weight of silence, and about the difference between being quiet because you choose to be and being quiet because you feel you have no other option. She spoke about the courage it takes to speak up for someone else when it would be easier to look away, and she mentioned Priya without naming her, simply saying that sometimes one person choosing to say something can change everything. When she sat back down, the hall was quiet for a moment longer than usual. Then someone started clapping. And then another person. And then the whole room. Charlotte looked down at her hands, composed as ever. But her eyes were bright. There are stories that remind us what grace actually looks like. Not the kind that exists in ceremony or title, but the real kind, the kind that holds itself upright under pressure, that responds to cruelty without becoming cruel, that finds its way back to warmth after a long winter. This was one of those stories. A girl who was also a princess. A boy who didn't know how to belong. A father who chose conversation over confrontation. And a school that decided, in the end, that every voice, every single one, truly does matter. Sometimes the most powerful things that happen are the ones that are never photographed, never announced, never given a headline. They happen in quiet rooms and empty corridors and small moments of forgiveness. They happen between people who are just trying, in their different and imperfect ways, to become better than they have been. And sometimes, without any fanfare at all, they leave everyone who witnesses them completely speechless.